Chapter 29. Where's your mind? Puzzled, Pike swung his gaze from the booth where a crowd of Afghan National Police sat and looked across the table at Julie Meadows. They were seated at a local restaurant the Marines frequented when they were outside the zone. The corpsman was easy on the eyes. He could tell she'd gone to some effort. Um, sorry, some effort uh, to make herself look presentable in the uniform, which wasn't an easy thing to do, but Julie had pulled it off. What? He asked. She smiled at him and didn't seem angry. Always a good sign. Exactly. You're somewhere else, Pike. Not here, not right now. Pike didn't know why he'd agreed to another dinner. He didn't need the company. In fact, most of the time he preferred his own company. I didn't know I wasn't paying attention. If I wasn't as confident as I am in myself, that could hurt. I'm not very good at this. What, eating dinner? Eating dinner with someone. You eat dinner with Marines all the time. They don't expect you to hold a conversation. I didn't know a conversation was going to be a problem. Julie's tone remained light, but Pike knew he was on dangerous ground. It's not you, it's me. She sat back from him a little, and he felt the distance between them widen. When I'm out in the field, I stay switched on. I always notice stuff, except for dinner partners. Pike ignored that and pointed his chin at the Afghan National Police gathering. Over there. Julie sipped her water and casually glanced at the other table. Her eyes glinted and her mouth hardened. Captain Zaroff and his cronies. Cronies? You have another word? Pike was thinking that they were more like a gang, not policemen. Not anything as genteel as cronies. I do, but I try not to use it around women. Well, I feel relieved. At least you noticed that part, even if you weren't keeping track of the conversation. Yeah, it's been tough to concentrate when I'm looking straight at the guy who killed the Russian prisoner I took into custody. Pike focused on the other table. So, you've heard of Zara? What do you know about him and his cronies? Just rumors. None of them flattering. But sounds like the brass have their hands tied. So they leave him in play? Zaroff is connected. Having him arrested would be an embarrassment to the Afghan National Police and the U.S. military. I've also heard that he can be counted on to monitor Tango activity, that he has connections to more sources than a lot of his fellow policemen do. I'm starting to wonder if it's because he's doing business with them. It's a case of the devil you don't know, Julie said. Looks like Zara knows just how far to push things, and the Afghan National Police and the U.S. military let him take it to the limit. Pike sipped his tea. Could be that someone should take a closer look at Zara. You? Pike looked at her. Could be. Because he murdered the Russian? That caught my attention. Zaroff didn't kill the Russian just to put points on the board. He was covering up something, or taking advantage of the situation somehow. How? I don't know yet, but I suspect that that's not all of the ordnance the Russian munitions dealers brought into the city has been found. I think that's what Zaroff is hiding. You could tell. You could tell someone. Pike shook his head. If people are already looking the other way for this guy, he's going to have to be caught with his hand in the cookie jar to change the status quo. Zaroff glanced at his cell phone on the table, then picked it up, excused himself, and stepped away from the table to talk. Pike watched the Afghan National Police captain. He's talking in Russian. Julie's eyes narrowed. You can hear him? I can read his lips. You get raised on foster homes. It's a skill you pick up, like learning to read body language. You were raised in foster care? Too late, Pike realized that he'd revealed more about himself than he intended to. He'd carefully kept the conversation loose, talking more about what the gang was going on in Kandahar or the mechanic work he did with Monty in the garage back in Tulsa. Yeah, it's something I don't talk about a lot. Thankfully, Julie left that alone. After a moment, Zaroff returned to his table, talked to the men, and then departed with a few of them in tow. Pike looked at Julie. Sorry, but I gotta go. To me, that conversation looked like business, and I need to find out what Zaroff's up to. If there are still munitions floating around out there, we need to nail those down. Julie nodded. I understand. Zaroff disappeared through the door, and Pike stood and grabbed his rifle and helmet. Can I get a rain check on dinner? Next time I'll be better company, I promise. Julie smiled. I like that. He rested a hand on his forearm. forearm. She rested a hand on his forearm. Careful, Pike. Always. Pike gave her a wink and walked through the tables, only a short distance behind Zara. You should stay out of this. What's done is done, and you get riled up over what's happened ain't gonna do no good. You listen to me, Pike? No, you ain't. I can tell. You got that mad on. It's gonna get you killed one of these days. So that voice speaking there is the voice of PD in his head. That's why it's in italics. As Pike moved through the shadows, he didn't know if the voice was Petey's or his own common sense. He told Petey the same thing whenever Petey had gotten bent over something that they couldn't do anything about. On occasion, he gave himself the same advice, and sometimes Petey had thrown the warning in Pike's face just to get his attention. However, even after all those bad things Pike had seen during his biker days and during those tours in the sandbox, Captain Zarov's cold-blooded execution of the Russian cut Pike's bone deep. Pike objected to being made a fool of on general principle, and he didn't like the idea of a helpless man getting killed like an animal. But the thing that bothered Pike most of all was not knowing what was going on around him when it concerned Nazarov. The Afghan National Police captain was a privy to too many marine operations inside Kandahar. Not knowing things could get a man killed. Not knowing his best friend was working to a piece of drug business and betraying the people he was dealing with could get a man killed. Not knowing what was going on in the sandbox could get a Marine and his whole squad killed. That wasn't going to happen on Pike's watch. So he was going to figure out what angle the police captain was working. At the same time, Pike resented the fact that he felt so responsible for everybody. This wasn't his thing. Only he couldn't stay out of it. With his M4A1 slung over his left shoulder and his M9 riding at his hip, Pike followed Zaroff and three of his hard cases through the shadowed streets. The strident ring of a cell phone reverberated over the street, sounding out of place. Zaroff reached into his pocket and withdrew the instrument. The glow of the phone played over his cheek and beard as he pulled it from his ear. Zaroff halted and looked along the street. With cat-like reflexes, Pike stepped into the shadows recessed of a nearby shop door. The business was closed, as were the others along the block. He slid his M9 free and kept the pistol out of sight behind his leg. Speaking quickly, Zaroff replied in Russian. While Pike and Petey had been in California, they'd done some business with the Russian mafia in Los Angeles, and Pike had picked up some of the language just by observing. In the foster homes, he'd learned that a kid who couldn't pick up on the words between words and the nonverbal communication of caretakers sometimes stepped into a threshing machine. He understood enough of the exchange to know that whoever was on the phone with Zaroff wanted a meeting. The guy also wanted his property back. Zaroff grinned and said that arrangements could be made. He gave an address not far away and said that he would be there in 20 minutes. Anger flowed through Pike as he got underway again. Pike wanted to know what Captain Zaroff had, and he needed to find out before the Russians arrived. He kept the M9 in his hand. On the next block, Zaroff and his men stepped into a small hotel. Darkness filled the windows of the building and shadows loitered at the entryway. Only a weak yellow light shone inside the office area. Pike went through the door and ignored the small man reading a newspaper on the other side of the checkout counter. The clerk glanced up only for a second, and then quickly looked away. Treading on the outsides of the stairs to make less noise, Pike went up. He watched ahead of himself, but he listened behind. He didn't want to get caught on the stairs. Down the hallway on the third floor, Zaroff and his men walked into a room on the right. The building primarily housed small businesses. Signs on the doors on either side of the hallway were marked in Pashto and English. Evidently, the last few years of Western military operations in the area had brought about English language concessions. Intending to simply walk past the doorway, Pike was listening intently. But the door sank inward, and one of Zaroff's men popped out with a gun in his hand. Do not move, American. The man shoved the barrel of his pistol into Pike's neck. Pike had to resist the impulse to take the weapon away from him. No matter how much it was emphasized in training, too many guys hadn't understood the lesson about touching an enemy with your weapon. Doing so made the gun wielder especially vulnerable. Pike froze and slowly lifted his hands. Hey, I'm not looking for trouble. The man wrapped his fist in Pike's collar and shoved him towards the room. Stumbling, Pike went through the door. Another man caught Pike by the lapels and swung him up against the wall. The room was small but held 4 desks and occupying chairs. Books and computers occupied the tops of the desks. City maps and post-it covered a bulletin board on the rear wall. But the walls were otherwise barren, offering no clue as to what type of business took place there. Who are you? The man holding Pike's lapels stared into his eyes. Behind this man, the first man checked the hallway and then retreated back into the room. He glanced at Zarif, who was sitting in an overstuffed chair beside the room's only window. A breeze ruffled the thin, worn curtains. He is the only one in the hallway. The first man lowered his pistol, but he didn't pull it away. No one else is with him. Zarif glared at the man. Go downstairs and watch. These Americans don't travel alone. The man nodded and let himself out of the door, closing it behind him. A third ANP officer stood slightly to one side so that he had a clear field of fire with his pistol. Holding Pike with one hand, pinning him against the wall, the second man searched him quickly. He took the M9 and the M4A1, slinging them on to the man behind him, who placed them on the desk. Zarif stared at him more intently. I know you. Pike said nothing. Of course I do. You are the American who found Estaviv. Pike filed that name away and stared back at the Afghan National Police captain. His captor's breath pushed against his face and stank. What are you doing here? Pike kept silent. Zara's face turned to stone. He glanced at the expensive watch on his wrist. We don't have much time. What you say in the next few minutes could save your life. Pike smiled. He didn't believe a word the man said. He and Petey had dealt with it, too many guys like Zarif. They lashed out when they were threatened, and Pike's presence there was a definite threat. Pike spoke softly, shifting slightly to cause his captor to shift with him. The fact that the man wouldn't kill him until Zarif ordered his death was something he intended to take advantage of. You murdered Estaviv. I want to know why. Zarif relaxed somewhat and rested his pistol on his thigh. I did not murder him. I shot him before he could kill your squad mate. Sure you did. And the other reason I figure you did was it was because there's something in it for you. Pike shifted again. This time the man holding him took a fresh grip on his shirt and pulled a combat knife from his belt. The man pressed the sharp edge against Pike's throat. The knife slit the flesh just enough to sting. You do not know what you are talking about. Pike grinned. Really? Then why are you meeting more Russians here tonight? A frown etched into Zarof's face. He glanced at his watch again. Kill him. Pike had already known the command was coming. He'd read it in the captain's body language. Even as Zarov spoke, Pike reached up and caught his captor's right wrist in his strong left hand and kept the knife from biting in any deeper. Jamming the heel of his right palm into the man's chin, Pike hit him hard enough that the man's teeth clipped off the edge of his tongue. Blood dripped down his chin as his eyes started to roll back in his head. Pike kept hold of him, using him as a shield while the man behind him jockeyed for a clear shot. Bracing himself against the wall for extra leverage, Pike shoved the knife wielder backwards and drove the man with the pistol like a football tackling dummy towards the desk with his weapons. All three of them smashed into the desk and broke under the impact. Pike tracked his M9 as he dropped to one knee. The two ANP officers were down in a heap. The knife man, mostly unconscious, but the other one trying to heave his comrade's slack weight from him. He fired his pistol twice, but the bullets went wide of Pike. Scrambling, Pike closed his fist over the M9, brushed the safety off with his thumb, fired 2 rounds into the gunman's face as he brought his weapon around. A bullet tore through Pike's collar, letting him know how close he had come to dying. With the adrenaline singing through him, thinking about the times he and Petey had ended up in similar situations, Pike couldn't stop a smile from spreading across his face. He turned his weapon towards Zarov. The captain stood with a 2-handed grip on his pistol. The man didn't look so calm and controlled now, but he didn't freeze up. 2 bullets came close enough to Pike's face that he felt the heat, and a third ripped through the material over his right shoulder. Pike sighted his by instinct, aiming for Zarov's chest the way he had been trained in the military. Both rounds ripped into the Afghan National Police captain's center mass. With a shocked and pained expression on his face, Zarov stopped firing and looked down at the blood spreading across the front of his shirt. And then he forced himself to fire again, managing to get off 2 more shots before Pike put a round between his eyes. Zarov stumbled back and sat down on the chair behind him. The pistol slid from his nerveless fingers and thumped against the floor. The man with the knife started to come around and retrieve a gun just as Pike was getting to his feet. Pike brought his pistol to bear. and fired a single shot, and the man lay still. Grabbing his M4A1, Pike slung the assault rifle over his shoulder and crossed the room to Zara. The Afghan National Police captain sat in the chair with unseeing eyes. Shoving the pistol into his holster, Pike knelt and quickly searched the dead man, knowing the gunfire would draw someone. At the very least, the other Afghan policeman would return to the room. "You don't have time for this. You got to get out of here." Pike still didn't know if the voice in his head was Petey or his own. Those times with Petey didn't seem so far away right now, not when he was playing in the sandbox. Death could lie on the other side of the next heartbeat. He went through Zarov's pockets, but didn't find anything that looked like it might have come from the dead Russian. Zarov's contact on the phone had seemed to want his property back, though. There should have been something. Doesn't mean it was small enough to be on this guy. Pike, get moving. Despite the ringing in his ears from the gunshots confined to the office, Pike heard running footsteps out in the hall. Cursing in frustration, knowing tonight's events had gone a lot further than he'd thought they would, Pike abandoned the search and went to the window. He peered in the street. The drop wasn't far. He shoved his head and shoulders through, holding on with his hands, and flipped himself outwards. Arching his body, Pike propelled himself away from the building so that he wouldn't get ground on to a hamburger against the rough exterior. He hit and went down at once, rolling to dissipate the momentum, coming to his feet effortlessly, only to be blinded by a sudden flare of lights. He reached for the M4A1, but an American voice brought him up short. "Stand down, Marine!" The command came from the Humvee that rolled out of the alley. A powerful searchlight plucked Pike out of the inky darkness. Releasing his assault rifle, Pike started to dodge to the side, thinking he might still get away. Only two Marines stood there as well. Both of the men were young and had their weapons to shoulder. He knew that if he moved, they would shoot him. Slowly, Pike raised his hands over his head and dropped to his knees. There was nowhere to run, and the whole room full of dead people he couldn't explain. Chapter 30. "This is a mess, Lieutenant Bridger." Standing in that business office with the dead Afghan National Police lying where they'd fallen, Heath had to agree. "Yes, sir, it is that." Major Lee Hollister glared at the carnage. He was in his 40s, a short, powerful man with angular features and prominent cheekbones. He was liaising between the Marine Corps and the Afghan National Police. "And I've got to clean it up because our allies among the Afghan National Police are not happy with Marines gunning down their people." Hollister glared at Heath as if he were responsible. "Which means you're going to do your best to help me." "Yes, sir." Only Heath didn't know how he was going to do that. He'd been laying out plans for tomorrow with Becca and Towers. Now it technically was tomorrow, and the day promised to be much different than he'd envisioned. This private, "He belongs to you?" Heath's gut reaction was to point out that Pike didn't belong to anybody, but he quelled that because it wasn't an answer Hollister was looking for, and Heath wasn't going to sell a member of his team down the river. If Pike was in the wrong on this, and it looked like he was, Heath, as Pike's commander, was still prepared to stand beside him. "Yes, sir." What was he doing with Zara? That was news to Heath. He'd been summoned, but then pulled into the room while Hollister's investigative team took over. No names other than Pike's had been mentioned when he'd gotten the notice to come running, but the man's name struck an immediate chord. Zarif? Heath pulled out his iPad and flicked through his after-action reports. "Captain Ajna Zarif?" "Yes," Hollister growled irritably. Stay up, Lieutenant." Heath curbed an impulse to point out that this was the first time he'd heard Zarif's name, and that he'd never met the Afghan National Police captain. Having him not prepared was Hollister's choice. Heath wasn't there to argue, and doing so would put him in the same brig as Pike. "Yes, sir. I will, sir." "Which one is Zarif?" Hollister pointed to the dead man seated in the chair near the window. Heath approached the man and took a couple of pictures with the iPad for later comparison. "There was an altercation between Zarif and a group of our people earlier today." He paused. "Correction, yesterday." "What kind of altercation?" "Zarif executed a Russian male our Marines had taken into custody." Heath used "our" as a subliminal reminder to Hollister as to whose side he was supposed to be on. "Executed," Hollister frowned. "Yes, sir. The Russian had been taken into custody following a raid on a site that turned out to be a bomb-making facility. A lot of the ordnance was Russian." He left it up to Hollister to connect the dots. An attorney learned not to oversell the logical parts of an argument. Of course, it didn't hurt to underscore parts of that logic either. "I've been told that some of the assembly also showed Russian influence." That was a little leading because no one had reported anything about the techniques employed to put the bombs together. Then again, if someone used Russian ordnance, it only stood reason that some form of Russian technique would creep in. Hollister cursed. Do we know anything about the dead Russian? He's a member of a criminal organization. How do we know that? Heath brought up pictures and then tilted the iPad so the lights in the room didn't glare off the screen. He let the tattoos speak for themselves. My specialist says this guy was probably out on the outs from the organization. He didn't mention that specialist had been Pike. Hollister grimaced and wiped his face with his big hand. I've seen tats like that before, and I've seen Russians in Kandahar before too. He heaved a sigh. Do you have a name for that man yet? No. So your private wasn't out here on your orders? No. He had decided to tell the truth, but he wasn't going to let Pike swing in the breeze. Hollister swiveled his attention to one of the men supervising the evidence collection team. Lieutenant Sims. What did Zarev have on him? Sims, a slim African American, gestured to one of the desks. Got it all bagged here. Hollister stepped towards the desk. Heath followed discreetly behind, took a couple of images of the contents on display. Zarev had been carrying a thick wad of local currency and one nearly as thick as that had American, Chinese, and Russian notes. Keys, spare magazines for a pistol, change, breath mints, and a smooth stone completed the personal effects. The captain was carrying a large bankroll. Hollister rifled through the currency with a ballpoint pen, spreading the bills out. He didn't say anything, but he knew that both of them recognized that the presence of so much cash offered mute testimony to the fact that Zarev was conducting some kind of business on the side. Hollister put the ballpoint pen back in his pocket. It appears Zarev might have been doing some business on the side. He didn't say anything. Hollister addressed Sims again. What did the private have when you took him into custody? Sims guided them to another desk. As he studied the desk, he noticed immediately that Pike didn't carry much other than essential equipment, and all of that showed evidence of well-tended care. The only thing that caught Heath's eye was the compass. That wasn't regulation marine equipment, and Heath didn't know what to make of it. I don't see anything incriminating, Lieutenant Sims. Nor do I, Major. When you took the Marine into custody, was there any indication of alcohol or drugs? No, sir. Straight as a board. Except that he came in here, killed these men. Hollister waved a hand around. He took pictures of the bullet holes in the walls and the weapons laying on the floor next to the dead man. Did Pike fire all those rounds? He knew that Pike hadn't done all the shooting unless he deliberately shot in every direction, judging from the wounds on the dead man. Pike hadn't wasted a bullet. Hollister looked at Sims for the answer. Sims shook his head. No, sir. The Afghan police got off some rounds, too. You ask me, from what I'm reconstructing here, Pike was fighting for his life. He was just better than these guys, way better. Did Pike say anything when you took him into custody? No, the sergeant who took him said once Pike knew he wasn't getting out of the situation, he gentled down immediately. Heath figured he could make a point of that in Pike's favor. Pike didn't want to hurt any Marines. Hollister cursed. Or maybe he just knew he was going to get shot. Resisting the impulse to offer a quick rebuttal, Heath bit back an observation. Thankfully, Sims couldn't keep his own thoughts to himself. Begging the major's pardon. But this guy, sir, he wasn't afraid of getting shot. These AMP guys had him cold. Sims pointed to the wall by the door. Looks like they had Pike here, probably held him at bay with this knife. The lieutenant indicated a combat blade on the floor nearby, only he didn't stay put. He pointed to the bullet holes in the wall. This second guy shot at Pike. He approached one of the dead men, squatting down to point out a bullet wound high on the man's right shoulder. He shot his own guy in the process. Then Pike got loose. He stood and looked around the room. My guess is that it was over pretty quick after that. A small smile flickered across the lieutenant's lips. 3-on-1 odds, sir, and they had their weapons locked and loaded. Impressive. That was Pike, all right. He studied the dead police officers. The problem wasn't that he knew what he knew about Pike. It was what he didn't know about the man. Hollister cursed again and then focused on Heath. Lieutenant, Sims is going to work the scene recreation here. Even if he's right, which I think he is, that still leaves the question as to what brought Pike here. I want that question answered. So do the Afghans. Yes, sir. Can you clear it so I can talk to Pike? It'll be done before you can get there. Thank you, sir. If you would, I needed to clear another person to talk to Pike. Sergeant Towers? Not a problem. Actually, I was thinking Corporal Shaw. Hollister thought for a moment and then shook his head. I don't know him. Her, actually. Hollister's eyes twitched. Her? Yes, sir. The Marines aren't any place for a woman. Someone should have told her that. Still, I suppose you need someone to talk to the Afghan women. He held his irritation in check. There was a lot of controversy over women in the military, but they'd been there since Vietnam. Not as many as had volunteered for service in hotspots back then, but he knew an Air Force colonel who had been excellent at her in-country post. Corporal Shaw is a good Marine, sir, and I think she can be of help with Pike. She's got a way of getting people to open up. It's your call, Lieutenant. Thank you, sir. You're dismissed. He fired off a salute and then turned and headed for the door. Just get back to me the minute you find out what went on here. I've got to talk to these people. And if I don't have an explanation for this mess, heads are going to roll, starting with yours, Private. Yes, sir. Chapter 31. Lying on a thin mattress in the brig, Pike slept with one arm folded over his face. Only faint streams of light bled through the grill on the door. He still smelled the gunpowder on him from the encounter with Zaroff and his men, and the odor made him restless, tainting his dreams as fragments of memories wove in and out of his imagination. Hey, bro, about time you got here. I've been telling our new friends all about you. Petey sat at his table in the back of the bar. He was grinning and acting like he didn't have a care in the world. In reality, he was $8,000 short on inventory for a delivery to a man seated across the table from him. Pike didn't say anything. Road dust from the south of the border covered him. Early that morning, they closed the cantinas in Juarez after crossing the border the hard way to bring in a load of merch for the local banditos. For the last few months, Pike had been rebuilding engines and doing other mechanic work on sleds over in Austin. He'd been doing fine for himself, staying off the outlaw trails and making a legitimate living. Pike hadn't planned on the semi-retirement from the criminal life. It had just happened. A guy in a shop had loaned him the tools he needed to fix his Harley, then talked to him about a project bike he'd been having trouble with. A conversation for a guy who'd lost the use of his legs but still wanted to feel the wind in his face. Curious and maybe a little challenged, Pike had hung around. P was off hanging with some chick he'd found, spending the money they'd made on their last transport job. Every now and again, Petey would call and check in, surprised that Pike was still working at the garage. Petey told Pike about the work he was doing with a guy who specialized in identity theft. Told Pike there was a position open for him if he wanted. Pike didn't want. Petey liked the tech jobs. He had a head for hacking and stuff. He learned that at one of the foster homes he'd stayed in before the man and his wife got carted off for identity theft. They hadn't made any other mistake than to leave the computer where Petey could get to it. Petey hadn't known as much back then. He'd only been 12. He still had a lot of learning ahead of him. He told Pike about it, about the way the cops had broken in and thrown the foster rents on the floor, handcuffed him right there while some of the other kids screamed and cried like it was the end of the world. Petey had laughed when he told the story. Pike had laughed too. But Pike hadn't been feeling it then. He was getting over a wailing by his latest father figure. The guy didn't like the way Pike looked at him, but he ordered Pike to look him in the eye when he was talking to him. There was no winning a deal like that. So Pike hid his bruises and laughed at Petey's stories because that was what Petey expected. Petey always wanted people to join in the fun. Petey was laughing that day in the bar too, and Pike wasn't feeling that either. Got a problem, bro? Petey shook his head and kept his hands on the table in front of him. Franco, this guy, he nodded towards the guy across the table. He thinks we're short on the merch. That was when Pike knew that they were short on the guns. He remembered the underground casino not far from the hotel where they crashed. He noticed the dark circles under Petey's hollow eyes. It didn't take a rocket scientist to put the pieces together. Petey had a thing for long odds, and it almost got him on the wrong side of the balance sheet. That was what had ended the job, working the identity theft ring too. One morning he showed up at the bike garage, 5 minutes ahead of a hard crew looking to make an example out of him. They'd warned Pike to stay out of it, but it was Petey, and nobody worked Petey over on Pike's watch. Pike grabbed a set of tire tools and waded into them. Minutes later, after he pulled them off Petey and put a couple of guys in critical condition, he and Petey were on the road again. Juarez, Petey had said, because he knew a guy who needed somebody to run contraband into Mexico. They'd done work like that before. Pike missed the bike shop, and he missed the old guy who ran it. He'd seen the old man in the shop while he'd helped Petey back to his bike. The old man knew the score. Judging from the tats on his forearms, he'd ridden the outlaw trails himself. You got, you don't gotta go, brother, the old guy, Jonas, talked softly. You don't gotta run. Pike shook his head. Got no choice. Cops will be here soon. He jerked a thumb over his shoulder. These guys are connected to somebody. They won't stay beat down. The trouble Petey gets into usually has long arms and even longer memory. There's another way. Jonas tapped the blue lines on the cross tattooed on the inside of his left forearm. That tat was the last one he'd gotten, the last he'd ever was going to get. You just got to wrap your head around which way you want to go. Pike smiled. Got a church message before. Didn't take then. It's been good working with you. Then he climbed back on his bike and ridden out of there with Petey. Now, 4 days later, he was looking at Petey across the table from Jorge Franco, a guy who didn't take prisoners and had a habit of leaving people who'd betrayed him scattered across highways for buzzards to feed on. You are short on the merch, Franco spoke Spanish. He was a thick-set man with big hands and a broad face. Mirrored sunglasses covered his eyes. A neatly trimmed goatee and mustache framed his mouth. His teeth were big, and there was a lot of gold in his grill. Pike had never seen a man with so much gold in his mouth. Franco's hair was jet black, hung on a broad shoulders, silver chains glittering on his throat. Two other men, both of them big as well, stood on either side of the table, young guys who would do whatever they were told to do. They operated maybe a step above the guns they carried, and there would be no mercy at their hands despite their youth. Pike had seen burnouts like them in the foster homes and the orphanage. Humans had the capacity to teach their young to feast on them and on each other. What I want to know is what you're going to do about it, Franco stared a challenge at Pike. All of them knew what was going down. Franco was going to make an example of Pike and Petey. He was going to leave them spread across some street alley. Franco thought Pike was there to beg for his friend's life, knowing Pike wasn't going to have the money either. Petey thought Pike was going to save him, betting on one of those small chances that he couldn't resist. Pike told himself that. The thought crossed his mind that Petey just hadn't wanted to die alone, but that was more selfish than Pike was willing to believe. Staring into Franco's dark eyes, Pike spoke in a soft monotone. I'm going to ask you to let my friend go. He made a mistake. He won't be doing business with you anymore, and you can afford to lose $8,000. Franco had laughed at that. You're out of your mind. I'm going to kill you both. He didn't get to finish his threat because by then Pike was in motion. They'd frisked Pike for weapons. The problem was they didn't realize anything could be a weapon. Pike snatched a long-necked beer bottle from the table with his right hand, smashed it in the face of the man on his right. As the unconscious man spilled towards the floor, Pike rammed the broken end of the bottle up under the other man's jaw and sliced its windpipe. Franco only had time for a single shot that glanced off Pike's side, cracking a rib before Pike had the man's pistol in his hand and put 3 rounds into Franco's head. Rib burning, having to force himself to breathe because it hurt so badly, Pike swung to stare around the bar. People were already hustling outside. Nobody there owed Frank anything, and probably some of them were glad he was dead. Crowing loudly, probably jacked on something, Petey came from behind the table and clapped Pike on the back. I knew you wouldn't let me down, bro. You never have. Got to get out of here, Petey. Pike knelt and picked up another pistol, shoving it under his belt at his back. Cops will be here any minute. Sure. Just let me get this stash. Petey rummaged through Franco's bloody clothes, taking money and drugs. Okay, I'm ready. Breathing shallowly in an effort to keep the cracked rib from hurting too much, Pike followed Petey out of the bar. Only this time they didn't make it. 2 police cars full of Diablo bikers waited outside. Dust covered their cracks, road leathers, and a few of them were just grinning skulls with the flesh pool around their necks. They raised their weapons to fire, and Pike knew he and Petey were going to die this time. Told you, brother. Told you there was another way. Jonas stood to one side, out of the field of fire. The tat on the cross was clearly visible on the inside of his arm. You stay on that road, you're riding, Pike, you're going to die. The Diablos opened fire, and Petey staggered as blood poured out of him. Pike woke in a rush, heart pounding, and he could feel the phantom pain that had long ago cracked rib lancing through his side. He blew out the air out of himself, knowing he'd hyperventilate if he didn't. He sat up on the side of the bed, and his head spun like it was coming out of a blender. Just a dream, not real, bro. Keep it together. He rubbed his face, feeling the calluses wear under against the stubble. He stared into the darkness around him, thought of Hector in the garage, got all tangled with the memories of what had happened to Petey and the shooting with the Afghan National Police. It was getting hard to sort them out. Gotta make life simple again. Things are getting too heavy. It's time to drift. Let it go. Just let it go and find a piece of the highway you ain't been down before. He settled back on the bed, putting his back against the wall like he used to when he was in foster care. If anything came at him, he'd have to come at him from the front. Sitting up quietly, he listened to his heartbeat and worked on keeping it at a measured rate. He was going to survive this. All he had to do was get back to the States and let the witness protection people find him a new place. He'd crawl out of the sandbox one last time. Maybe even crawl out of the protection program too. Then get good and gone.